Welcome to our program, Expanding Our Horizons. I'm Paul Saint Amand. I'm here with Dr. Greg Carroll from Salem State University, a professor of peace and conflict studies, who has done a project that is continuing in Liberia. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you.
I know you've made several trips already to Liberia, and before we get into the project specifics, I'd be interested to know, and I'm sure our audience would too, something about Liberia as a nation. How did it begin? What is some of its history?
Okay. It's actually, it's a really interesting history, particularly for us in America, given that in 1847, essentially it was founded by freed American slaves. So what happened was that the slaves were sent back to Africa. Most of them, all of them really, didn't know where they had originally came from. So they ended up in this region of the world which they called Liberia, Liberty. They named the capital after the 5th president,
James Monroe.
Monrovia. Unfortunately, what happened was that the slaves replicated what they were used to. So what they did was that they knew if you were powerful, you enslaved. And so the freed slaves then turned around and enslaved the indigenous population. And really, it was that process that set the seeds for all of the conflict that led up to the Civil War in 1980.
Coming out of the Civil War, I can't imagine what that country must be like. Is there a sense of nationalism for those folks?
There is. There is definitely people who identify themselves as Americo-Liberians to this day, and they're still seen as somewhat of the elite. But whether you're Americo-Liberian or indigenous Liberian, there is a fierce national pride that we had some problems. Liberians see Liberia as a jewel of Africa, and they're very keen to get back to that status.
I guess that's the good news.
Yeah,
quite frankly.
And they have. There's some very good positive signs. Even in the short time that I've been going to Liberia, from the first couple of times when there was no electricity, it was a diesel generator if you could afford it, to now Monrovia has pretty close to 24-hour electricity service, and they've even got streetlights.
Oh my goodness.
In some places.
In some places. If you're going to talk a little bit about the geographical aspect of it, your project is located in Monrovia and in Gunta?
Actually, we work with the United Methodist University, and so they have their main campus in Monrovia, where all of their students start, and then depending on what they do, the nursing, 4th and 5th year nursing students spend 2 years in Gunta, which is where we have our main field site. The agricultural students spend their 4th and 5th year down in an area called Salem, which is where the agricultural school is, or was, and that's actually part of a World Heritage listed site. Monrovia is on the coast, and Gunta is on the Guinea-Liberian border. It's about 160 miles from Monrovia on some very poor roads. During the rainy season, impassable.
Impossible to pass.
It generally takes, it's 160 miles, but it takes, on a good day, 7.5 to 8 hours.
My goodness. And the third site, which sounds like it's also on the coast?
No, it's sort of midway, but it's down the bottom of the country.
I see.
And it's very difficult to get to.
Must be an interesting experience for your students who are used to our highway. What do your students think about the way in which perhaps folks are having to deal with their infrastructure there?
There is an element of culture shock, I think, that we're used to our comforts, we're used to things being easy, and that definitely isn't the case. So I guess the students that tend to come with me have, in a sense, self-selected. They're either in my peace and conflict studies program, or they're interested in that sort of an area, or they're interested in Africa. And so by and large, it's a shock, but they adapt really well.
So you have some type of orientation for them, so prior to going they get a feel for what they're going to be dealing with, or are there surprises?
There's always surprises. Just at times, there's a region just out of Monrovia called Red Light, and it's if you like, the main shopping area, and it's just completely chaotic. There is people everywhere. They're burning rubbish everywhere. And it's just noisy, and that tends to make sure the windows are locked up and the doors locked, and it's
So infrastructure-wise, it sounds like they have a lot of work to do. And are you involved at all with the infrastructure of the country? Are you having to help out there in any way?
only sort of tangentially in terms of policy.
I see.
And certainly, as we perhaps we'll talk about the project, dealing with the university, dealing with trying to develop the university infrastructure. That's where we are.
In terms of infrastructure, are they getting money from other places to, or do they have some sort of resources themselves that are able to funnel back in and build the country?
That's sort of a two-part question.
Okay.
They have the resources, but are they being funneled back in?
I see.
Firestone,
Yes.
the American tire,
It's been there for some time.
has been there since the 1920s,
Yeah.
and it was for a long time the major source of American rubber, and it is the major industry in the country. In fact, the Firestone in the early years was responsible for approving the national budget.
No kidding.
So they were certainly enmeshed in the
Corporate influence for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they were there. They're still there. They just renewed a 99-year lease for the lands that they use, and there is amazing amounts of rubber plantations, both Firestone and then local homegrown industries.
Yeah.
So Firestone is there. There's always been the flagging of international shipping through Liberia. So that's always been a source of revenue. And just recently, in the last 2 to 3 years, there has been the discovery of large quantities of oil and gas. So that, in theory, the development of that will be starting apparently in 2015.
2015. Are there? I would think there would be American companies that are looking to that.
There are American companies, but there is also China has a huge influence. In fact, China is doing most of the heavy engineering work in the country at the moment. There's quite extensive road development that the Chinese are doing. The Chinese are also building. The University of Liberia just had a new campus built by the Chinese, not without problems. But China definitely is in Africa in a big way, and they're in Liberia.
Liberia, language-wise, are they largely English-speaking? I know there are many tribes there.
When you move away from Monrovia, the indigenous languages are more prevalent,
I see.
but the national language is English. It takes a little while to get your ear around listening to Liberian English. It's almost a pidgin or a creolized, to a certain extent, English.
I would think that would take some getting used to.
It does.
Absolutely, absolutely. And given that there is this tribal structure, is that part of a conflict within that country?
Well, certainly, I think we alluded to it earlier, the Americo-Liberians and indigenous community. There was Samuel Doe, who came to power in the 1980s, was an indigenous Liberian, and that was the first time that an indigenous Liberian had ruled the country.
And he came to power how? Was it democratically elected? Or
No.
It was
No, it
a
was
military coup.
It was a military coup.
I see.
That has been the pattern through the successive changes of government, really.
Right.
Doe was forced out of office through a military coup that brought Charles Taylor into power,
Right.
who was recently found guilty for crimes against humanity, for crimes committed in Sierra Leone in furthering the war in Sierra Leone, nothing to do with his own atrocities in Liberia.
I see. So is it a presidency or how is it defined?
He was a president, and there was supposedly democratic elections that he held that put him back in power after the coup.
In our earlier conversations, you mentioned that he was actually an American Liberian.
Yes, in fact, he was in jail here in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Oh, really?
And somehow disappeared out of jail. So he didn't serve his full sentence, but then under a year later was in Liberia and was one of the leading warlords against Samuel Doe.
And now, ironically, he's back in jail.
Yes, in the UK. serving a 50-year sentence.
So this was the Hague
Yes.
court.
And the only other interesting is his son, who's called Chucky Taylor, is the only American who has been convicted of war crimes. And he was charged here in America, and he is currently serving a 97-year sentence.
My goodness. How did this peace building project begin, and what led you to think about Liberia?
I was doing some work with an NGO called Global Citizen Journey. I was helping them. They were working in Nigeria, and they were in the process of moving up the coast and were setting up a project in Liberia, so I was helping them do that. And through that process, it was an ideal time for me to say, well, no, I'd like to also incorporate my students from Salem State, and the administration at Salem State was very supportive of me doing that. And so that's how it grew. I took a group of 8 Salem State students to Liberia, and we worked with the University of Liberia, with some graduate students from the University of Liberia. So that's the first time I've been into Liberia. I've been to Africa before, but never to Liberia.
But it sounds like you've gotten so much going on. How did you make the contacts you needed to be able to do what you're doing now? Because as I sort of perused your laundry list, quite frankly, of activities, it's quite extensive.
We were very lucky. Actually, a student walked into my office, and
A Liberian student.
yeah, she walked in and said, I hear you're going to Liberia, and I'm Liberian, and I'd be interested in going. And so we chatted some more, and she said, my dad could probably help. So, okay, we chatted some more, and she said, Dad could probably put you up.
Sounds
Okay,
better.
sounds great. As it turns out, Dad is the Bishop of Liberia.
And how does that translate as in terms of power within Liberia?
Very. And that's, in a sense, where we've been able to get to where we are today in a relatively short period of time, is that we have had very good access to any issues. We can talk to Bishop Innes and things get smooth.
My goodness.
Or it's enabled us to be a lot more effective than we would have been.
Sure.
And he is
A friend in the castle, more or less.
essentially, he is a good friend of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who is the current president of Liberia. She is a United Methodist, and she worships with the bishop.
I see.
So,
And she has come to some prominence lately.
well, for a while, she was in 2008, was co-awarded the Nobel Peace Prize
Yes.
with another Liberian woman, Lema Gabawi, who really was and she's an amazing woman, but she was essentially the woman that stopped the civil war in Liberia. That was the PBS is showing, have a movie called Pray the Devil Back to Hell, and that's chronicles Lema Gabawi's work and the work of Liberian women and how they literally stopped the war. It's quite an amazing movie.
We should have more of that on the screen, I think. A lot of countries need to see something like that, because that's interesting that women were the ones who basically had done the work needed to stop the wars.
Right. And I should also mention there was a third woman who also was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize at the same time.
Right. Peace building in any country, I think, would be difficult. What I do know about peace studies and peace and conflict studies, quite frankly, is that it's not easy. You mentioned that you had connections that certainly help that process. But coming out of a civil war, there must be tremendous conflict still. And how has that affected what you're trying to do?
Well, certainly where we go and what we've been doing, we are safe. I think that's important.
Very.
And there is no active conflict, because that would make our work impossible.
Sure.
And what we've been able to do is to work with the situation that's on the ground, which is largely peaceful, and look at, we're a university, we're not a large aid agency, and therefore we can't bring in lots of money. What we can bring in is human capital, and we can support the development of human capital in the country. And that's essentially what we've been doing, using peace, if you want, as the umbrella. Or I know it's used differently in other academic settings, but if you want, a peace ecology, where peace forms an umbrella over a community. And in many respects, you can't talk about peace if you're hungry.
That's true.
And so part of what we're doing in Gunta at the moment is setting up an aquaculture project. You can't talk about peace if people are sick. And so part of what we're doing in Gunta is supporting the healthcare system there. You can't also talk about peace if there's no hope for the future. So what we're also doing is working with a K-12 school there. And you do need to talk about peace. And so it's working with the community and with the school to talk about, right, how do you deal with conflict? What are the ways that you can deal with conflict? And Liberia actually has a really interesting history in conflict remediation. They have a process called the Palaver Hut, which is in all villages throughout Liberia, they have a round hut that has a central place in all villages. And so if you and I have a conflict, then you and I would go to the Palaver Hut and we would talk out our differences. Now, if you and I can't resolve our differences, then we bring in a community elder.
So it's a mediation process that
Yes.
takes place after that.
So it's an indigenous mediation process.
It's wonderful.
It has fallen by some tough times.
I'm sure.
Certainly a lot of the younger communities see the Palaver Hut as tainted, given that, well, you've had this and you still have the war.
Mhm.
So there's been some reticence by the younger generation to go back to the Palaver Hut. But it's slowly moving back into, people certainly understand, they're talking about, well, we need to palaver.
It's a wonderful concept, and
It is.
It's what peace building is all about in terms of mediation and being able to actually manage conflict. That's terrific. What were some of your concerns as you started this process?
I don't think safety was a real concern. I felt comfortable where we were going and felt safe enough in that. I was concerned for my students in that I was worried that this would be too far beyond them.
I see.
And if anything, I was way off the mark. All the students that have gone have just thrived on the experience, and a number of students have made multiple trips. So, and if they haven't made multiple trips, they've used their Liberian experience to move on to jobs or to graduate school.
Wonderful, wonderful. Have your students written about their experiences in Liberia, besides maybe journaling, but maybe have published around it at all? Or?
Not broadly, but we have done some writing. All of the students who participate in the Liberian fieldwork present at an undergraduate research day back at campus. And we have actually one of the students that's gone with me the last 2 times is at the moment getting some work published in an academic journal.
I see. I mean, this is a perfect service learning opportunity as we think about service learning being taking the skills and the techniques that you've learned in class and applying them to a community in some way, and this seems very ideal in that regard.
It is. It's the perfect opportunity to, it's the Deweyan approach to education. It's you learn by doing. And it works. It's been a really powerful experience for students.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the specifics in terms of what students are actually doing there. I'm amazed when I look and I see that there's something like almost 4 million people that actually live in Liberia. That's half the size of Los Angeles. And I'm not sure about the size of that country. Can you relate it to any of our geographical regions? I mean, is it like Texas? No.
No.
Much smaller.
It's probably more the size of, I would say, Massachusetts. It'd be more the geographical size.
So there's a sense of sparsely populated, except for perhaps Monrovia.
Monrovia and a few. Gunta is one of the bigger communities, but there are spread throughout. You can travel for quite some time without running across any towns or any villages.
And as you say that, I think, okay, so you're going to start a project on peace building, and of course you've got Monrovia, which would make sense. But a country like that, trying to decide what you're going to do and where, It seems like that would have been difficult unless you had those connections and people said, gee, this is what we need here. Is that how it all came together?
The first trip that we did, one of the things that we were doing is that we got together just under 150 community leaders and elders in Monrovia, where we ran an open space workshop and a world cafe. And it really came, a lot of what we're doing came out of those discussions, where it wasn't, well, me as a foreigner or me as a Westerner coming in with all of these great ideas and saying, I can solve all your problems. It's what we did very consciously and very carefully was to listen.
So it's really from the bottom up,
This did a lot
inside
of
out, as it were. Yeah.
where we were able to listen and, what are the needs? And there are many, and many of those needs are things that we couldn't meet.
Of course.
But there were things that I felt that as a department, as an institution, we could meet. And so we talked further around those. I was able to get a number of other professors from Salem State University interested as well. And that's how the project grew. So there was a broad framework of an idea, but what we are doing really did come from the librarians themselves.
It wasn't until you gathered some folks together, and the folks that you gathered together to have this conversation, who were they?
I have an education professor who's been travelling with me, Rocky Schwedel, and we've been working together for many years, and he's a really solid academic and a wonderful teacher. Two other people that have got involved, Joe Butner, who runs the Cat Cove Marine Labs here in Salem, and has also been selected as a Fulbright specialist to further the work that we're doing in Liberia, which is wonderful. And the other person is a nursing professor, Vicky Morrison. And the four of us form essentially the core team here, and we have our counterparts in Liberia that we communicate with.
Are they largely college professors there in Liberia, or community leaders, or how does that work?
Primarily, I mean, we're focused on the university, and that's
course.
where we have our memorandum of understanding. But then there are people, the station superintendent in Gunta, Reverend Priscilla Jaya, is a wonderful woman that we lean on a lot and need her to help support our work, and she's one of the main drivers in Gunta. Another woman in Monrovia, Helen Roberts, works with the Liberian Annual Conference, so she's part of the Methodists, but she also has sort of a quasi-governmental position as well, and certainly influence within the government.
I see. I'm curious, you and I had a conversation prior to our interview today about Paulo Freire and how, in many respects, the folks that had gone to Liberia, settled there, that were American, basically oppressed the indigenous population. How has that played into the work that you're doing? Has it been, I mean, I'm sure you see threads of that.
I try and, as the outsider that's coming in and leaving all the time, to, everybody's Liberian. Whether you're America Liberian or indigenous Liberian, you're Liberian.
Right.
And I take the premise that we're all here for the same reason. We're all trying to advance Liberia and make life better for Liberians, period. And so, as much as possible, and it has been that way so far, the notion of, well, I'm America Liberian and they're not, hasn't come into any of our situations.
I see.
So, and it is, I mean, it almost makes them sound the America Liberians as the baddies. They went in and oppressed, but it's the same as we have, in personal relationships here in America or everywhere. We learn from our parents, we learn from our elders, and that's what had happened for the slaves that were freed and then went to Liberia.
Yeah, I see. Well, I'm going to ask you about your students again, if I might. They get credit to do this, yes, I would assume, and it costs them a little bit to get over there themselves. I mean, is that part of financial aid that they can?
If they are eligible for financial aid, they can certainly use it. There is a course that's associated with this work, and it is, it's very much a fieldwork course where you mentioned earlier what sort of preparation do students
Sure.
have. So we spend time, so the trip happens during spring break, so we have the lead up of the semester to prepare them for Liberia.
Which is how many weeks exactly? I mean, before spring break, it's usually in March, right?
Right. So it's not a ton
Not
of time.
a lot of time.
It's not a ton of time, but it's enough to give them a bare bones understanding of what they're going into.
And these students, excuse me, these students have had peace and conflict studies courses prior to that, or are they coming in fresh?
Initially, all of the students were my peace studies students. So yes, they had had sort of the introductory peace courses.
Okay.
But now, I have a number of students that have come along that don't necessarily have any peace background at all. A number of the biology students, for example, that are traveling with us now. So the preparation was giving them some understanding of peace and conflict before they go, and doing the field work, and then coming back and having debriefing and having them work on their research projects that they've been doing to then present.
I see. So they get how many credits?
They get 3 credits. And
It's not a lot for doing something like that.
it's not a lot, and it costs them a lot. But I think that if you asked I'm sure that if you asked any of the students that traveled, they had a wonderful experience. They found it an incredibly rewarding and enriching experience that for a number of them really solidified for them, this is what I want to do, or what I want to do with my life. In fact, one of the students that traveled with me the first time was a little bit of a lost soul to a certain extent. I think she wouldn't mind me saying that.
Okay.
But she wasn't sure where she wanted to go, but she came with me to Liberia and sort of the light went off. And this is what I want to do. And she's now a graduate student who is actually coming back with me this time to finish her graduate studies.
That's got to be rewarding.
So yeah, she's a wonderful woman.
So if I asked you a philosophical question, what does Dr. Greg Carroll get out of this?
I guess this is the work that I'm most passionate about. This is work that I've been doing, if not in Liberia. I was doing it in Timor-Leste, in the Indonesian archipelago before that. So it's the work that I've done for a long time, and it's more than me just being a professor in a classroom. And I'm not denigrating that at all, but that's only one part of what I think can be the role of an educator. And so I get a lot of satisfaction out of doing the work. I enjoy being back in Africa. And I think that I'm making, with my students and with the Liberians, that we're actually making a difference. Because the project that we're doing, it's not just, okay, we're going to stay in Gunta. We're setting Gunta up as a demonstration site where Liberians can then use that site to duplicate it across the country. We have another 3 sites that we're going to be, that will be the next phase where we will expand to. Also hoping to have, we are providing training to the university faculty, so this can be something that essentially will be, all right, I can step out of completely. And then the project can completely run itself by Liberians.
Which is the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if the project requires me or somebody here from America to fund it, to run it, and to make sure that it keeps going, then it will, for as long as we do that. But as soon as that support gets withdrawn, the project will fall over. And in effect, with a lot of development projects, that's what happens. The project works really well while you have USIP, USAID, any of those major institutions working, but as soon as they step back, unless there's good succession planning, and unless they've brought people on the ground up and worked with them and had them being invested in the project, it will go nowhere.
That certainly is the history of attempts to do things in different countries. I want to focus now on the actual projects themselves. I know that you are involved with a number of actual projects. I think our listeners might want to hear something about the Conflict Stories project.
We're using the One Laptop Foundation, which is started at the Media Labs at MIT with Nicholas Negroponte. They're the little green and white exocomputers, and we have received small grants from the One Laptop Foundation to take those exocomputers to Liberia, and so we're using those across all of the projects. But one of the things that we're using those for is for students to, because they have audio and video recording capability. So what we're using is we're having students interview their family members about the conflict.
I see.
And sort of a show-up in terms of documenting the conflict. As one of the recommendations at the end from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report at the end of the Civil War was that this needs to be documented. Mm-hmm. And it's also one of the recommendations that's received the least amount of attention. So part of what we're trying to do is to help document what happened particularly in Gunta, but then as this develops across the country.
So it's actually also educational for the students themselves to hear their parents talk about what really happened in ways they may not have talked about otherwise.
Right. And it's a way for them to hear, because it's almost like year zero, and the war for a lot of students can be an uncomfortable experience, or can certainly be an uncomfortable experience for their families. And so what we've been trying to do is to give them the tools so that the questioning can be non-confrontational and not have students reignite old wounds. Yeah.
So when we talk about conflict mapping, which is one of the categories that you're doing with, what is that exactly?
Part of it is identifying there were so many different warlords, so many different conflicts within conflicts that happened in Liberia. So even that story has never really fully been told or fully understood. Why did the conflict appear over here when it was mainly focused on this area? Or why is it that even within villages we had within a village fall apart, and then villages attack one another when they had been living together for generations? So it was trying to understand what were some of the precursors for that.
So not only looking at it demographically, but also socially in terms of what's going on.
There's a really interesting NGO called Action on Armed Violence that has been doing some really good work with ex-combatants, teaching them agricultural skills, and then part of the ex-combatant coming into the program is for them to agree to go back into their original communities. And so it's providing the ex-combatants with the skills to deal with the conflict and deal with, for a number of them, some of the atrocities that they had perhaps been witness to or party to go back into a community and say, well, I'm here, I'm ready to make amends, I want to make amends, and this is how I can help support this community.
It's interesting how you're starting within the community, but you're also starting with the children. In particular, I find that fascinating. K through 12 peace building. What's going on with that? How does that work?
Well, ultimately, it's the children who are going to take part. They're going to be the next generations. They're going to be the ones that are either going to perpetuate or cease any of the conflict. We often see conflicts, we all see it in the news, wow, where did this conflict happen?
Sure.
But when we really look at the conflicts, they're generational. And for Liberia, we could say, well, really, if you want a starting point, it's 1847. So we've had this long genesis of the conflict, and so we need to try and draw a line and say, well, okay, we now need to slowly move back from that. I think part of the problem with a lot of peace building is that it becomes all right, I've got how long?
Yes.
And so it's this short attention span where I need to make a fix now. If we're really going to make a fix, then the fix has got to be with children.
And that's long term, so you're really looking at the larger picture rather than just making that quick fix.
Yeah. And so it's children, I guess using the UN definition of children, or youth if you want, up to 35.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
So rather than just, well, it's only elementary school children or middle school, whatever, it's that youth bulge as well, that, an uneducated, idle, 20-year-old can be a very dangerous situation.
Having come through the Civil War, and employed, non-employed, or how does
Well,
that?
typically the only thing you have is a gun, and so therefore, how do you, if that was your livelihood, that was the way you made money before, how can we offer you an alternative, or what sort of alternatives can we offer you so that you're not going to go back to that gun?
So that really means, in part, and I'm going to think about what you are also doing by way of aquaculture. That there are pieces of this, it seems to me, that are geared to helping those people who don't really have a profession per se, and can do things within the village to make money and have a life of some sort. Can you speak to the whole aquaculture thing? I saw photos of people holding fish that they were harvesting. Very exciting. I'm a fisherman, so it's always exciting to see somebody with a fish in their hands.
It was very, very fun. On one of the first trips there was a water holding pond for a rice paddy.
Oh.
And so they did have some of the infrastructure there already, but they weren't using it for fish, other than they knew fish were in the rice pond. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we did was that we got there with the biology professor and the biology students, and we drained it for the first time to do a fish yield and to find out what was there, how much was there. And it became a big community event. It was quite fun.
My question had to do with the aquaculture aspect of this project in terms of the economic aspect, because it sounds like you're doing more than peace building. You're also basically have your hand a little bit into economic development.
To a certain extent, again, I guess that comes back to what I would view as this notion of peace ecology or an interdisciplinary framework. A lot of projects either sit at the macro level, when we're talking about international governments and treaties, whatever, or the sort of the meso level, where you're looking at the sort of perhaps a tribal interactions. But then sort of the third piece within, I would argue, within the peace framework is sort of that the individual and interpersonal. And what we've tried to do with the aquaculture project is take sort of a stab almost at all three of those components. We're providing you with a source where you essentially can't do this by yourself. You are going to need other community members to develop the pond, maintain the pond, harvest the pond. So there's this level of interpersonal interactions that you're going to need to have. Then you've got sort of the moving up into the tribal, the selling of the fish and generating a sustainable living. And then finally sort of being able to take this across, quite at a macro level, but taking it across the country where, here is a sort of a package that, not to enforce into different communities, but to say, here are some things that you can possibly do, that covers off on a number of components that will prevent or help prevent a resumption of violence. If we're providing you with viable alternatives and a reasonable look at a future.
And it is. I mean, it does provide that, it seems. I would see that also in terms of the education that's happening here too, with these students with the laptops in particular. I assume they have internet connections. Is that satellite, or how does that work?
Actually, they don't. Well, they kind of do and they don't. The one laptop computers are a really interesting little machine where they don't need the internet. If you have two of them turned on or more, they form what's called their own mesh network. So they can form their own little network within themselves, and so they can share information. They can video chat across that mesh network. And then if there is one access point to the internet, then one of those exocomputers can connect to that, and then all the rest of the mesh network.
So they're networked in.
Yeah, but it does it almost organically. They're a very interesting little machine. And so we're using those as a way of providing professional development for the teachers, for the administrators, and for the faculty at the university. And we're also using them for the students as well. So they become this tool that gets used at multiple different levels.
What is Bishop Innes's village?
Bishop Innes comes from Camphor Mission, which is where the bishop was raised. His father actually started a mission at Camphor. And so he was raised and educated at Camphor Mission. And so Camphor Mission is his is a special spot that he'd really love us to work in. But going back to what we were talking earlier, the infrastructure at Camphor Mission is such that what we were trying to do we couldn't achieve at Camphor initially. We're looking, Camphor will be one of the next sites that we hope to help develop. But part of it is it was so remote, there is no electricity. There's really nothing there. So we just couldn't do anything there.
That's something that one would use these bike pedaling to basically generate electricity to run in laptops and that sort of thing? Or?
They were. The exos, when they were originally shipped to a number of different countries, they came with a hand crank.
Oh.
And so they worked really well in the short term. The hand cranks weren't robust enough so that they broke too easily.
I see.
So you really do need a source of power, a diesel generator or something that you can plug the exos into. But they're getting long in the tooth. They've been around for a number of years now, but they are still remarkably reliable. They still provide 3 to 3.5 hours worth of use on a charge, which is comparable to what we have.
You can certainly get something done under those,
Yes.
under those conditions. The Gunta University GUMMS, is it?
GUMMS. Gunta United Methodist. Well, there's 2 GUMMS, which
Okay.
makes it even more confusing. There's Gunta United Methodist Mission Station, and there's the Gunta United Methodist School. That's all part of one compound, and part of that is also a hospital. And so the United Methodist University's 4th and 5th year students do their 2-year rotation at the school there and at the hospital.
Is this part of the nursing education that you're
Yes.
talking about? And what is your role with regard to the nursing education?
Part of that is bringing Dr. Morrison along and having her working with nursing faculty, having our nursing students who have come along, interacting with and working with the nursing students, the 4th and 5th year nursing students there as well. And it's very specifically within the nursing, it's looking at providing professional development and some short coursework, tropical and infectious disease control courses.
Now, I noticed that you're doing a lot with health mapping. Is that coming through that school? Are they actually doing the mapping, the students are?
Yes, it's part of what we're in the process of trying to set that up.
Okay.
But that's, again, trying to use the exos as a way of identifying a location and then being able to map, because there are a number of small communities and villages around Gunta. And so trying to at least get some sense of, even population, numbers, genders, ages in the communities around Gunta. It's, nobody really knows.
Nobody knows. I'm curious about what kinds of health issues are there?
Malaria is huge. Yellow fever. Liberia is in a yellow fever control zone. So they're 2 major concerns. Your normal, lesser developed community problems. Dysentery is a huge killer of children.
About birthing?
Birthing, like it is everywhere, is they have a dearth of midwives, and so birthing is done very much in the community, and therefore, is a large takes a large toll on the females of Liberia.
How do you keep track of all of this? I'm curious, because there's quite a laundry list of activities that are going all at once.
It is a large laundry list. I guess part of the reason if I am able to keep a handle on it all is that for me it sits in a very, at least in my mind, a framework that fits really nicely about the way that I view peace and about the way that I view development. And so these pieces fit together very nicely. There are other aspects. I'd be really interested in getting the School of Business involved, or our School of Business involved, to do some, help out on that side of things. Certainly the marketing of fish, doing those sorts of things could be really beneficial. I could see that as value adding later on. There needs to be a lot more, just even general education, not only at the K-12 level, but also through the university. Just recently, I don't know whether you noticed in the paper, there was a small piece about that in the recent entrance exams for Liberia, 25,000 people sat the exams and 0 passed.
My goodness.
So that certainly raised tensions in the country.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. But I mean, this is a country where they're not going to have television in every village.
Oh, no.
So communication is an issue.
Communication is an issue. Like in lots of post-conflict settings, there is a reasonably good cell phone network. And that, even with that, creates an interesting community sense, because you can't just go to your home and plug your cell phone in.
Right.
You need to go to where if there is a diesel generator in your village, you need to go to it at different times and plug your cell phone in. So that creates sort of a place that community can develop around a charging of a phone. Actually, cell phones are cheaper. Most people text, but it's certainly a lot cheaper in Liberia than it is even here.
So you've been there four times, your students 3 times.
3 times.
As you're talking around community development and everything that needs to be done, you mentioned it would be nice to have somebody from a business school as part of this, certainly about the marketing of fish. If you had to think of 2 other things, so we get a magic 3 here, things that need to be done that you would be involved with, what are the other 2?
I would say that the sort of doing sort of communications, I think, is a really important thing. Liberians rely a lot on radio, and so that's a component, but using the radio in a really proactive manner. They do some delivery of health messages, and there is some sort of political, adult education that happens over the radio, but that's an area that I think needs to be developed more, and whether that comes more from the universities or more from the government, and that would certainly be one of them. Mm-hmm. I think ultimately the thing that I guess we're doing part of that really needs to be done is the development of education, is providing for a future. Without that, then it's very easy for the youth to fall prey back to somebody who either has a grudge or wants to, use violence to carve out, I can have my own little fief, as long as I provide enough youth with guns and drugs.
Yeah. You spoke about what still needs to be done, but the reality is you have an upcoming trip. Can you speak to that for a minute?
We have, at the moment, there are 12 of us, possibly 14 of us, who will be travelling back to Liberia in March for spring break, and that's going to be an interdisciplinary group again there's the 4 professors that are going: peace, education, biology and nursing, and we have students from those different disciplines that are travelling with us as well, and so they will be working within their own areas, but they will also be taking part in sort of some peace building work as well.
So these students can come from other universities?
Yes.
Is that an invitation to?
It was. There was.
Even today, are you inviting?
Certainly, if people would be interested in being part of the trip or coming along to this or subsequent trips, by all means to get in contact with me. We have students from the Mass College of Liberal Arts who will be travelling, and also a student from UMass Lowell this time around. But I have talked to a number of different institutions that have expressed interest in being part of, and I see that as, if this program is going to grow, it can't be just me, it can't be just even the 4 of us or even Salem State University. Certainly Salem State can have a central role, but I see this, if it's going to develop and grow, that it needs to be broader than just us. It needs to be a Commonwealth-wide or even broader.
Greg, what can you tell me about the food that you ate there? It must have been interesting.
It is. There's some... Liberian food tends to be very spicy. It's a lot of rice, fruits, wonderful plantains, small bananas.
Mm-hmm. Familiar with those.
And absolutely amazing mangoes, which they have.
So it's largely vegetarian, or is there meat involved in this?
There is some meat. They do a lot of chicken. Fish is a big source of food as well, particularly along the coast, and freshwater fishes. And They've started to move into pig and doing some pig farming, but primarily for most of the Liberians, and certainly during the war, it was, if anything, bushmeat. So monkey, crocodile. So they're fairly scarce now, and there's a couple of interesting sorts of deer that we used as well, just small. But primarily the sort of in the towns, in the villages, most of the meat would come from chicken and from fish. But they also do some interesting foods with cassava leaves, where they have a national dish called fufu, which is a ground cassava that you eat with your fingers and just, you don't chew, you swallow. It's very good for filling your stomach. It expands as soon as it gets any water near it.
And it's called fufu.
Fufu, yes. And normally you take a fufu in your fingers with very heavy spices. Something that my students have had a hard time adjusting to.
So is every meal like that? I mean, do they do breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or is it one meal a day, or how does it work?
Fufu takes a lot to prepare, so that would be an evening meal.
I see.
But you would often have rice, eggs for every meal, chicken for pretty much every meal, plantains.
Your funding source, if you will, has largely been university. Is this something that, let's say, corporation or companies could be part of in some ways to support the work you're doing?
Certainly. I mean, our trips really are student funded at the moment. We've received a small grant from the One Laptop Foundation to provide laptops, but it's very much a shoestring that we're operating on. So certainly, if anyone would be interested in supporting the program.
Certainly those oil and natural gas people who perhaps have some money to
Yes,
do something around education rather than...
I have approached Firestone, and
Oh, good.
but
Nothing.
nothing
Okay.
nothing
At this point.
so far, shall I say.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. This has been a wonderful experience having this conversation with you about Liberia. I'm looking forward to learning more about it as you continue the work that you're doing, and I thank you for doing that work.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
I'd like to thank the audience for watching us tonight and hope that you have learned a lot about the work that Dr. Carroll is doing in Liberia, and we'll listen to see how it continues over the next few years.